We talked about two archetypes last week, and tonight we're going to go into the other two of the four that I think are fundamentally important for understanding the mature masculine, or what I call the masculine potential. Now, as you know, there are many archetypes of the masculine which are present in the psyche and which inform a lot of our behavior and which have an appropriate place, such as the trickster, the puer, the hero, etc., etc. But none of those are really archetypal paradigms for the potential masculine. They have their appropriate place, and in another setting I could talk about exactly how they work. But these four are images of what can be and ways of thinking about what is going wrong when things don't work, which is most of the time in human history and culture. Tonight, see, last week we talked about the king and the warrior, and tonight we're going to talk about the magus, or the magician, and the lover, the archetypal lover. And what I propose to do is to jump into these and to I think the best thing for me to do is to talk about them both before the break. And then let's have a break and then come back and discuss this and elaborate it as far as we can before our time is up. If that's okay with you, we'll jump in. Now, when I started off, I was talking to you about the dynamics of transformative space. It's very important in talking about the magician archetype to understand that this is the archetype of awareness, all awareness, what Jung would call consciousness, getting conscious, enhancing your consciousness. If Jungian psychology has an ethics of consciousness, it is grounded in the way in which this particular archetypal pattern potentially can be embodied in everyone, not just the person functioning as a magician. Magician is a social role. It's the same thing as ritual elder. In my personal view, the archetype of the magician is the covering archetype for a lot of other patterns which you hear people talk about. Let me just list a bunch of them that I think operate underneath this. The wise old man. I don't know why Jungians have continued to talk about the wise old man, because there are a lot of wise old men that are not magicians and do not function like a wise old man in the Jungian literature. When you're talking about the wise old man in the Jungian literature, you're talking about somebody who is serving as some sort of spirit guide, spiritual guide, some sort of psychopomp role. If you're doing active imagination with this figure, you're using this person as one who is guiding you on your own individuation process. So to the extent that this person is serving as a spiritual guide, it comes under this magus archetype, and I'll explain to you why that is in a little bit. But Jung talks about the archetype of the spirit coming in the form of he says in other places, the wise old man. Well, spirit archetype meaning again, often little men who show up in some way as helpers or guides. But the spirit archetype can be manifest in all sorts of symbols, in all sorts of dream images. But it always carries this role of the magus. In some places in the collected work, Jung comes right out and talks about this as the magician. You hear a lot of people talk in contemporary Jungian circles, particularly pop Jungian circles, about the shaman. Well, the shaman is simply one form of the magician. It is a form of a certain group of Siberian peoples. There are some other, they're Korean, it's a form in Korean culture. It's a form in some South American cultures. but it's one expression of this particular pattern of the sorcerer, the brujo, the medicine man. Contrary to what a lot of the Christians like to say, this is the archetype behind the priest. There's not a distinction between priest and magician. That's Christian propaganda. The priest, when he functions as a priest and he's competent as a priest, liturgically, he's functioning as a magician. He's not doing, hopefully, demonic magic, but sometimes you do. All healers sometimes practice shadow magic. But the distinctions that were made by Christian anthropologists early in the 19th century and throughout the 19th century between magic and religion are bogus distinctions. They do not hold up to careful phenomenological analysis. Most of those things were by Protestants who tend to be ritually tone deaf. I'm a Protestant, so I can talk about it. And they would tend to treat Catholic religion as magic anyway. So we just need to be clear about that. That kind of distinction is really a very dated, culturally biased, sort of colonialistic, chauvinistic, all those things. Anyway. So you can go on, and there are female versions of all these. You see it in the priestess, in the tarot deck, etc., etc. But in contemporary neo-paganism, you're a witch, you're a priestess, etc., etc., are expressions of the female side of this same pattern. Well, you see, that's the thing that I think is confusing about the way a lot of people talk about this. The senex, in the most positive aspect in a transformative process, would be this. But you can have all kinds of senexes that have nothing to do with transformation. And therefore, I would prefer to say that the magus includes some expressions of the senex, but not to confuse the two any more than we would confuse the king archetype and the magus. Because the king is also sometimes a senex. See? So for all of the way that we Jungians talk about phenomenology of religion and comparative mythology and all these things, we're not very careful about this stuff, and we don't look carefully at the progress that can be made in ordering these things, and we need to do a better job of ordering them. That's why I think it's important. It's very important to think about different roles. Think about role theory. Like, what is it this person's about? What are they in charge of? Why is this here in the psyche? Well, if you remember that tripartite scheme that I talked about last time in transformation, the thing that's known in anthropology as preliminal, and then liminal, and postliminal. Let me give you the three things that always come together when this thing is appropriately constellated. When this archetype is constellated, you will have two other archetypal forms always constellated with it. The archetype of initiation will always be with it, and the archetype of sacred space will always be with it. How is that? Well, it's really very simple. Don't make this more complicated than it really is. Just look at the up here. Sacred space never exists except in the context of initiation, transformation. That is, it's a special space that exists for the purpose of change, deep structural change in personality. And so this part, the middle phase in a transformative process, is always, to the extent that human beings can muster it, is always what Eliade calls sacred space, or what Victor Turner calls liminal space. Now, so when you think of the archetype of initiation, it always contains a movement into this kind of space, all sorts of education, humiliation, ritual wounding, all sorts of scarification, all sorts of humiliation processes that are involved in the scraping you down to the bones, dismembering you, and then reassembling you. Come out the other side. Okay. So, what is the relationship of the magus to this? It's always present. Well, it is the one that's supposed to be looking after this process. The one that's supposed to be stewarding this process, minding the store. Now, this is why when you get into a midlife crisis, you start looking for a special person as the answer. Now, a lot of people get confused about the nature and purpose of this special person, but they always look for special persons. Always look for a magic person. Get in a midlife crisis, you're going to be looking for a magic person, just like that. You're also looking for a special space, and you're looking for that esoteric whatever, esoteric knowledge. You can think it's sexual knowledge you're looking for. You can think it's religious knowledge. You can think it's professional knowledge. But you've got a fantasy going of esoteric special knowledge that you don't have and they got, and you're looking for it. You become a quester, in other words. The quester is constellated when you get into a transformation process. And you're looking for two things. You're looking for the space, and you're looking for the person that embodies and stewards it. Now, that is an actual ritual process in human culture forever, including now. And all you got to do is study anthropology and the history of religions cross-culturally, and you always see it. It is always there. There is no such thing as a human culture that doesn't have this. Now, in modernity, where people are so ritually tone-deaf, they don't talk about it this way, but you see the same thing. Your most secular, most, to his mind or her mind, rigorous behavioral psychotherapist, behavioral psychologist and psychotherapist that doesn't even believe in the psyche, when they do therapy, they are presenting themselves in the guise, in the persona of the ancient sorcerer. Now, most behavioral therapists hadn't had enough education in terms of culture to know that, and would be insulted if you said, well, you're functioning as a magician, and from what I can tell from your practice, you're a damn good one. Well, there are many damn good ones. I'm real impressed with behavioral therapists dealing with certain types of people, certain types of problems. There are some behavioral treatment schemes now of borderline personality that make us psychoanalytic types look sick. So I'm not knocking behavioral therapy. I'm just saying that even if you function out of something that's supposedly totally scientific, nothing to do with ritual, religion, or anything, you inevitably end up operating under this paradigm. So this paradigm doesn't have anything to do with Jungian psychology. It's just the way human transformative processes operate. And this is true whether you're Freudian, a Jungian, a behaviorist, a gestaltist, etc. This is the archetypal pattern for psychotherapy, wherever it's practiced. It's also the paradigm for spiritual direction.
How about all these people now going to transgender?
Same type of thing. It's some more of this New Age stuff. Well, I appreciate a lot about the New Age. The New Age people are much more sensitive to a lot of this kind of issue. In fact, most of the creative work that's been done on reappropriating ritual process in the context of transformation has been done by New Age types. That's the good news. The bad news is that they do not have the sense of evil and the shadow that Jungians do. And if you don't have a sense of the power shadow, and you're a Gestalt therapist, or some of the, to the left of the Gestalt therapist on this New Age business, why, everything is sweetness and light, and I'm just out here trying to help people, and we're going to put everybody on these channels, and these channels are going to lead people to the new redemption. You know, it won't cost you as much as a decent shrink, and get it cheap, and read New Age magazine. And the problem is this problem that we're dealing with in these two sessions about the difficulty of that archetype ego axis. I was thinking for, coming up here now, there's some things I got to make sure I've communicated. One is the seductive, aggressive quality of the archetype. I don't know whether I had sufficiently tried to communicate that to you if you hadn't got that. But these archetypes are aggressive. They're not passive. They're aggressive. They want you. They want all of you. Each one wants all of you. They're imperialistic. And not only that, they're good at it. Because once you get in contact with numinous energies coming off of any of these, the seductive power of it is enormous. And it has the capacity to overwhelm the critical powers of your ego more than practically any modern type can understand. There is a contagion aspect. Now, Jung understood this. This stuff is contagious. The best metaphor I know to use now is radiation. This stuff, you touch it, it's on you. You get close to it, and if you had psychological Geiger counters, they would go wild. But you see, it's hard to communicate this stuff. But the point being that a lot of these New Age types cuddle up to this stuff like it's just, nothing. Well, the only problem is that the grandiose self gets enormously overstimulated. It possesses the ego, and once it possesses the ego, as we'll see, but with both this one and the lover, number one, you're not likely to know when you're doing other people damage. You're so wonderful, and they're so lucky to be with you. And number two, when you do know you're doing them damage, you really don't give a damn. Because it's practically impossible to be coming off of the grandiosity of an archetypal inflation, archetypal possession, and have any ethics at all. That is why the narcissist has no moral concerns. Can't have any moral concerns because he's God. And it's not the God of the Judeo-Christian prophetic tradition. This is the God of I'm God, I do what I please. And so that is the important thing to get at, and the reason why you need a magus who is not an evil sorcerer is because there's nothing more inflating than being in this role anyway. Nobody in this role avoids being inflated a pretty good bit of the time. That includes clergy, all healer types. Guggenbuhl Craig's Power in the Helping Professions book gets at that, and all you got to do is just read that. Power, Shadow, in the Helping Professions. Medicine is amazing, the way in which it operates in medicine today, generally. The mystical, magical power of that is, and our transference to the medical profession is the amazing thing that we don't line them up and shoot them against the wall. All the poor people over here, all these hospitals closing on the south side. It's amazing. The uncritical attitudes toward the medical establishment, and it is because of an archetypal transference. All right. If you don't have that archetypal transference, then you treat people like they're just ordinary humans trying to make a buck. See? And if we could look at psychotherapists and MDs like that, we would treat them differently, including yours truly. Now, so you need somebody that understands this radiation. And you need somebody that knows how to help you get into this thing and in as optimal a way as possible, and to get out of it in as optimal a way as possible. And that is a huge, tall order. It's a much larger order than most psychotherapists know. And that's because it is so easy to get into the evil sorcerer position as a therapist. When you look at the pressure on a therapist to think about his or her own self-aggrandizement rather than the welfare of their client, if you look at that honestly, then it's amazing how much good therapy happens. See? This person is somebody you got to understand. When you got somebody that is responsibly carrying this, it is an enormous moral achievement. And I didn't mean perfectly carrying. Nobody carries it perfectly. Just good enough. To carry it in a good enough way. And if you want some idea of the figures, get the APA reports on unprofessional behavior among psychologists, of which are there in the American Psychologist to read, periodically. And the unpublished reports on the unprofessional behavior of clergy of all stripes. So the task, however, is to accept the archetypal transference. Now, this is coming out of the unconscious megas in the psyche of the individual. To the extent that you are really operating out of your unconscious, this thing is unconscious in you and me. So in an archetypal transference, we try to put it on somebody that will hold it. Now that transference itself, the placing of this projection onto a healer, whoever they are, that creates this transitional space. Even the Freudians admit it now. Some of the best work on this right now is being done by Freudians, particularly those influenced by D.W. Winnicott. If you want to read a good Freudian treatment of this whole thing I'm talking about here, read Boundary and Space by Davis and Walbridge. It's a study of the significance of Winnicott's work. And it's about this transitional space that opens out in the transference, through the transference. And there is somebody tell me the name of that anthology that came out not long ago honoring Winnicott. Between Reality and Fantasy, I think was the name of it. It was reviewed in the San Francisco Jung Institute Library Journal. But it treats this whole special space quality from that Freudian point of view. So we're not the only ones that are seeing this. This is not a Jungian thing. This is a human thing. And we still are working at it. But this is, if you were like so many people and you got into the Jung's collected works and you came upon all this stuff about alchemy and transference, I think, what in the world is alchemy got to do with transference? This man has completely lost it. Well, it's got everything to do with transference. He was the pioneer who understood that transference is not, as Freud thought, simply a repetition of an old object relationship inappropriately in the present. It is a field, the psychosocial, I think, biosocial field that's created when this transference, archetypal transference relationship is constellated. Now, if some of you know Heinz Kohut's work here in Chicago, the great self-psychologist, his discussions of the different types of transference that occur are apropos to this. An idealizing transference is really the transference of the megas on the therapist. you have to be able to idealize this therapist to a certain degree, or you will not put your archetypal transference in their keeping. And if they break your trust enough, you won't really invest this in them. And if you've been in therapy a good while and nothing is happening, and you can tell nothing is really happening, and you don't have much intense affect about your therapist, if there's no real feeling of this kind of stuff opening out, then this archetypal transference is not occurring. Now, it could be because of your own wounds and your capacity to trust. That is one of the things that happens in this. If somebody is really failed early in life, it becomes harder to project this. And that's why borderlines, for example, are so hard to treat. Because a borderline has a terrible time putting this archetypal transference on a therapist and keeping it there. The therapist is often not good enough to hold it. So the critical issue is, can the person who is playing this social role, number one, do they know what's going on here? That when someone is idealizing them, that may be exactly the right thing that needs to happen. And, it's funny, among a lot of clergy today, if the laity idealizes the clergyman, a lot of the theological education has taught this clergyman that they shouldn't accept this idealization. I'm just like you. We're all in this together. I'm just as crazy as you are. Well, of course, all that's true. But that's not what the person needs to hear, probably, right at that minute. So the clergy have been taught to do this psycho-spiritual striptease. I don't have anything to offer you. Honest to God, And that's supposed to be virtuous. But in fact, it's completely wrong-headed in terms of anything significant interpersonally happening, in terms of the transformative process. And that's why so many of them go to secular therapists all the time. It's one of the reasons. But anyway, so you can refuse the transference for whatever reason. Colette says one of the reasons that people refuse this, therapists refuse this, is because their own grandiosity is still so primitive that when the analysand idealizes them, it stimulates the grandiosity and it presses the therapist toward a manic place that they can't really handle. And so the therapist, because of their own instability, rejects the archetypal transference and, of course, will make some rationalization about why they're doing it. When, in fact, it's simply because they have got so much untransformed grandiosity themselves that they can't handle it being stimulated. So we know, in other words, we know a lot now, a lot more than I have time to talk about the way this transference operates. Now, I take a position that's different from a lot of Jungians about this stuff. See, I believe you can make a distinction between personal and archetypal transference. This is not a personal transference. This doesn't have a thing to do with you personally. This has to do with an archetypal transference that is a sine qua non if you're going to have a deep structural change, if a person in therapy is going to have a deep structural change. Now, behavioral changes can occur without this. All therapy has some kind of teaching involved in it. There is social learning going on. And but from a Jungian point of view, here's the problem. Here's the concern. It's not just Jungian. Also, the really sophisticated Freudians understand this stuff too. People like Harold Searles and Robert Lang. And that is to say, you can have a lot of therapy that goes on for a long time that is what Robert Lang calls lie therapy. That is, it's not deep. It is not structural change. It looks serious, but it isn't. And that occurs when this archetypal transference is not in place and fairly consolidated. Now, we can later, if you have questions, more further questions about that in our discussion, you can raise those, and I'll be happy to elaborate. But that is the social process and social purpose of this type of thing. That is, this thing, as all therapy, is in a human biopsychocultural ritual process. It is not isolated. And that is the way you must understand this archetype if you understand it appropriately. It's it's inevitably social. Now, but let's just look at the individual psyche now. What happens to an individual who is out of touch with this thing consciously? It's not in touch with it consciously. Well, what happens to a lot of people is they just don't have much self-awareness at all, or self-consciousness in the positive sense of that at all. They live their lives, do their jobs, have their families, and they don't think much about what it's all about or what the meaning of it is until something catastrophic comes crashing in to raise the question of what's this all about. But there are many, it's amazing how many people. I mean, if you work with business people, successful ones, some of you are consultants, I know, and work in that area. I do a good bit of that sort of thing too, but you have some amazingly sophisticated people, sophisticated in terms of business, sophisticated in terms of culture in some ways. I mean, real connoisseurs of the arts, but who never really thought much about what made them who they are now, where they're going, what is the meaning of their life. What the religionists always talked about is vocatio, or vocation. What is the purpose of my life? Jung talks about individuation is becoming the person that you uniquely are to be. That is a psychological version of the Presbyterian idea of providence. That is, there is some sense that there is a particular meaning for my life. And it's amazing how many people, well, as Socrates put it, live the unexamined life. When this thing is not constellated and consciously related to, that will be the case. And the question of meaning will be related to at several steps removed. And like the person will be involved, for example, in the arts, and may be actually fairly competent painter, or in some cases a fairly competent writer, but have very little sense of what makes them tick. In fact, what is happening a lot of the time is that their particular creativity is being used as a holding environment. It's being used, the art is being used to contain them. And without their art, they would be crazy. This is very common. This is your workaholic pattern and other expressions too. You know, you let the work contain you. Well, the work shouldn't be the container. Not in the spiritual sense or the psycho-spiritual sense. The work should be an expression of one's mature creativity. It shouldn't be the container and excuse for not being conscious. Follow that? Okay. Now, but this thing gets constellated always in life crises. You get a life crisis, bam, this thing gets constellated. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to find somebody for a transformative process. What a lot of people, now, a lot of people decide they're shamans at this point. You get it? They have a life crisis, and all of a sudden they have a mystical experience, an experience of the sacred, and they find that they are the answer. Well, we knew the world had all these problems, and now the answer is here. Moi. You know, I am it. And they're all over the place. The New Age community's full of them, but they don't have a corner on it. You know, the fundamentalists are this way, you know. Well, I had my life crisis, then I met Jesus, and now I'm a preacher, and I've got a television show, and I've got this ministry going, and I can play a hot rock and roll country piano. My name is, yes, and I'm very envious. You have to excuse my country western shadow envies the hell out of Jimmy Swaggart and his cousins, Jerry Lee Lewis and Mickey Gilley. But the point of it is that you look, see now, just look at that Swaggart phenomenon and try to muster a little empathy. I mean, I like the man, I love the man because he's very much like my shadow, see. But well, and as I say, his cousins. You know, I used to be a rock and roller back in the early days, but the thing about it is, you get these people that have this experience, these crisis, illumination, quote, offer themselves as the Savior, Redeemer, or their agents, but nothing has really changed structurally. In other words, what is supposedly awareness is pseudo-awareness. And then what you get is these people acting out all over the place. What you've got is a mega inflation. And we have seen a lot of that this year. We talked about Gary Hart last week, about the way you get when you're in that king thing and you get inflated, boom. Well, when you're in this thing and you get inflated, you're Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, Fritz Perls, Carl Jung. See? We don't know about Freud because his disciples had enough sense to hide all the papers and put them under lock and key until pretty soon. We're supposed to get into the archives before long, when we'll know what really happened between Freud and his sister-in-law. But and some of his other disciples. But this inflation that occurs, read William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. If you hadn't read that, get it and read it. One thing you'll notice, when does religious experience occur? In the middle of crisis. James doesn't pick that out, but you just study those lives. He doesn't talk about the way in which it is fundamentally a crisis experience. Very few people have any religious experience except in crisis. The ones that think they're not in crisis are in the worst crisis. So they're the ones that are really trying to hold it all together to keep from having a real disintegration. Conversion experiences, all that stuff exists in this context. What is the problem? Well, when you get real regressed under a catastrophic crisis, whether it's an externally caused crisis or an internally caused crisis. You know what I mean, internally caused crisis? Your childhood was so bad that you've got a psychosis waiting for a place to happen. See? And your poor little ego is under pressure from both sides, the outside world and the inside world. And the pressure you get into this crisis, you're very likely to think you're a mystic messiah. And you're very likely to think that you don't need to go to school and get any kind of training. You don't need to have any kind of initiatory process. You've already had it directly through the psyche, through the numinous experience. Well, Jung was right. He talked about the way in which all healing really comes through the numinous. All true healing comes through the numinous. what he talked about in other places but didn't talk about as much or as clearly is that the numinous without containment destroys you. And I would want to put my own personal view is always destroys you if it's out of containment. The numinous relativizes your ego when you encounter it. Encounter it, it melts down. You have a meltdown when you encounter the numinous. It melts down ego structures. If you have a vessel to hold you while you're not in ego structures, then that's transformation, or usually can be. If you don't have a vessel, then it can be the annihilation of the self and the replacement of that with an imposter personality who thinks he's God's gift to the world, or she thinks she's God's gift to the world. It is not the true self of the individual at all. It's what Jung would talk about as an archetypal possession. So in other words, this thing is in the psyche. Its purpose, its positive purpose, is as the archetype of awareness. When you develop your capacity to contain your functioning historically present and reflections on the future in a reflective vessel, and you work with this enough so that you feel that you've got this pretty integrated and you've got your own systematic spirituality set up so you can continue this without being in a therapeutic vessel, then you've got this megas thing conscious, you've got it fairly integrated, and you're on an ongoing relationship with it through active imagination, probably in the context of some community, and if you're a religious person, in some form of meditation and prayer. If you, now that is optimum, that's about as optimum as you get. Notice, community, not private. Privacy leads to inflation, always. Von Franz points it out. You stay alone, you're inviting Satan. And so the healthy expression of this thing is after one has developed some sophisticated personal awareness, that is continued to be developed in some context of some community that is fairly conscious and striving to be more conscious. And in the context of some form of human spirituality. That would be my position. That was certainly Jung's position. So, now what we got? Then we got to move on. The archetype is the archetype of awareness. If it's developed, made conscious, and related to in the course of individuation, then you become a really reflective, conscious person, and the ethical awareness and consciousness come with it. If you run into the numinous without adequate helpers, the chances are that you're going to think you're a magus. And again, there are a lot of people that are looking for such spiritual freebasing as this. And they go around looking for it all the time, and they're not satisfied unless they get it. And a lot of your retreat experiences and that sort of thing are in this category. And now there are a lot of retreat experiences that I would include in that. Retreat experience is fine as long as you've got a framework for it to fit into. You've got responsible leaders, and you got some place to come and debrief after the retreat experience and help keep all those demons that came out during the retreat experience sort of contained and worked with. Okay. And in terms of the process of healing, the healing process, either in therapy or in spiritual direction, that whole business of sacred space is key, cannot be ignored. Hopefully, this summer, I will be able to put the last touches on a manuscript I have now called The Magician and the Analyst, ritual process in psychotherapy, and hopefully that'll be published sometime early next year. So I've elaborated that a lot there. Now, let's save our questions about this, and let me talk a little bit for about 15 minutes about the lover, and then let's take a break, and then we'll come back and you can engage me and we'll discuss this sort of thing. Now here is where we should understand the meaning of seduction. But here it's even more difficult to be conscious, I think, than probably any other, because we are all so wounded in this area of our psyches from very early on. It's very difficult to find anyone who is either aware or honest or both who will not admit to having some very serious difficulties in their first love affair. That is, with mom and dad. And the whole field now of the study of narcissistic psychopathology is really a study of wounds in the capacity to love. And so let me just start off by saying this archetypal potential is there for individuals to be able to develop mature, responsible object relationships, which are very, very loving, capable of differentiation, capable of having an object that is not me, and capable of allowing that object to be a free, independent center of initiative. And yet, even though, damn you, you are free and can choose to leave me anytime you please, I still think you're so delightful that I want to do what I can to be in relationship with you. Now that, I hope you were listening carefully to what I'm saying, because it's very difficult to find people that can do this. Just look around in our culture, in the world, and you and me. Because of our needs are so enormous for the magic lover that we had in relatively good enough form between 1 and 4, that we have enormous difficulties in being an actually human lover in the present, because we bring that enormous archetypal need for the magic lover to our present relationships, and we put enormous demands on our relationships to be things that a human can never be. Period. Can never be. Should never be. When you study the object relations literature, what you find is that most of the literature is a study of using people as need gratifiers. That what we major in is using other people and exploiting them as need gratifiers. And it takes tremendous human development to get to where you can only use your partner some of the time. That's the goal. The goal as a human being is to get to where you regress into your neediness much less of the time. And that you try, when you are really regressed into your neediness, that you try to find somebody else who is a magus to put that neediness on, and not your partner. Follow? What is so damaging to human relationships is expecting them to be this magician container that is not ever to be. The mother transference for example, that we get in so many of our relationships. Men put the mother transference on the wife, but the wife also puts the mother transference on the husband. See? And this mother transference is a quest, archetypally speaking, often for the magus. So, archetypally, the potential is to be able to get to the point that you can take delight in and appreciate the other as other. See what is in fact there without reference to my needs. It is only at that point that you can really get into a sort of a play mode with the other. Narcissistic sexuality, where you have a massive wounding in the lover, you have the archetypal lover coming in and possessing the individual. The archetypal lover, when it possesses an individual, makes it impossible to value the other as a human much. Now, the interesting thing about the way this works is that when one is influenced by the archetypal lover, it enhances it turns up the power on the perception. It really affects the consciousness in a powerful way. You know about this one of the times you've been in love. It turns up the power. Now, there are a lot of people that say that is infatuation and not love. They are wrong. It is love, but it's not human in the strict sense. It's archetypal. That is to say, when you get a Don Juan, or the female version, say, for example, a borderline with histrionic qualities, or a histrionic with a underlying borderline organization. That's what we'd say technically. It's the woman that's trying to sleep with all the men in Chicago before time runs out. Now, it'd be very easy to see that as not having any real positive erotic component, but I think that's wrong. Because this is Aphrodite in a woman. And when you see promiscuity in a man, like the movie with Burt Reynolds, the man who loved women, well, that character did love women, plural. The quality of the archetypal lover, whether it manifests in a man or a woman, is truly that they do love them. When they look, they do see beauty. There is something that is magical about the person that they're perceiving. Does that mean that the consciousness of the person seeing them is bad? No, not at all. Blake is right. Most of the time, our perception is so bad at seeing beauty that most of the time our sensors for beauty are way, way down. And when you're in touch with this archetype, it turns it up. And when you look, you can see beauty. And things do glisten. And the glistening is in the object. It's not just in the eye of the beholder. See, that's what artists understand. A lot of writers. You take an artist, a great painter or a great writer, and you look through their eyes at the world. And the world they're seeing is a hierophany. It's a revelatory landscape. And see, the thing is that it really is probably that beautiful. It's just that most of the time we are wounded in that sector of our capacity to perceive. It's one of the qualities of being narcissistically wounded. You get bored easily. It's a litmus test. Show me somebody that gets bored easily. I'll show you somebody that's got severe narcissistic pathology. They may function great, but if you get bored easily, there's something wrong with perception. Lots of reasons to be tired in this world, but not very many to be bored. When it's bored, it's very difficult for that individual to have an appreciative consciousness. And there's where the key of this. The virtue, what is the virtue of this archetype? The virtue is an appreciative consciousness. The capacity to take delight in. Think about those words. To take delight in. Now ask yourself, what do you take delight in? If you're like a lot of men, and you've got the money, you take delight in your car. You look at that machine, and it's just a joyous thing to behold. It's a hierophany. I mean, men that are into their BMWs or their Mercedes, or if you're like me, a old Cadillac convertible, you just think those things are a thing of beauty and a joy forever. But that's one expression of it. And it comes out, and you just look at somebody's life, and you just pay attention. What is it that delights them? It really delights them. That's where this archetype's manifesting. What do Jungians call that for a man? We have a way of talking. In our subculture, we have a way of talking about that. What do we say? Yeah, it's carrying his anima, right? Now think about the meaning of that. If this car is carrying my anima, the anima is feminine, the archetypal context is I want to make love to it. That's what they're saying. Well, they're right. That's right. But you got to get your mind around what this is being said here. When you put the anima in something, it means, this is not something that you just kind of sit back poised about. I mean, you've got some libido flowing here, and you want it. It's something that if you have half a chance, you're going to snuggle up to and partake of. And this is a thing that is hot with humans. And again, the more wounded you are as a child, the less comfortable you will be with this archetypal potential for delight. And as an adult, you will be more bored, more chronically depressed, not manicky. Now, if you're manicky, you're more in touch with this. See, manic types are more into their disordered loves. See? It's not healthy love, but it's certainly love. And so, if you talk about the potential, it is this appreciative consciousness, the capacity to take delight in. If you study world religion, almost all of the traditions have got a representation of the god as the archetypal lover. What is the rule? The god is always promiscuous. Loves everybody. Shiva, Krishna and the gopis. You know that wonderful, I've got in my office, one of my offices, one of these canvas paintings with Krishna, the Lord Krishna, the Dark Lord, who's dancing with all the young cowmaids, and they all think that they're dancing alone with him. They're so enchanted, but he's got them all out there dancing. And in the Christian tradition, you see the same thing, Jesus the lover. And in those old evangelical songs that all the contemporary Christians are embarrassed about, it's just out there, right out front. Jesus, the lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly. You know, I walk in the garden with him. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Melt me and mold me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still. Archetypal lover. And the one that's my favorite is, there's a poem, a medieval Hindu love poem, written to Krishna, known as the Gita Govinda, or the love song of the Dark Lord. And it is the love poetry, ostensibly, between Krishna and Radha. And it literally drips with passion. And it is, frankly, unabashedly, a tremendous aspect of Hindu spirituality. Hindus love talking about the love nectar of the gods. And that's this archetypal lover aspect of the sacred and aspect of the archetypal realm. So what happens to humans is, when you have lived a dry and wooden, boring, depressed existence, you are just uttering, unconsciously, uttering prayers for the divine lover to come down and possess you. Come on down, Eros. And you take somebody, you get a relationship, a marriage, in which there is no archetypal lover stuff present. And that aspect of the divine is not consciously encouraged by both partners. Then you have a very dangerous situation in which Aphrodite is going to manifest either in the wife with some other man, or in the husband in projected form on some other woman, because this aspect of the divinity is going to manifest some way. So in human life, yeah.
Do fathers, can they do that to their daughters? If it's not happening in those other two ways?
Well, that's what happens in child abuse. In child abuse, the spouses have this locked out in their relationship, usually because of narcissistic wounds. Usually, although you'll hear all these people say, well, the research shows that people that abuse children are not mentally ill. They simply don't have any understanding of this kind of narcissistic pathology at all. But what happens is this archetypal reality gets locked out of the relationship, and so it starts getting projected. And usually the father, in this case, it's not always the father by any means, but the father is so wounded in this, his capacities as a lover, as a human lover, are so damaged by his childhood experience that he cannot have an affair. That would be too much of an attainment, too much of an achievement. He cannot have an affair. And so this is projected on the most defenseless one in the environment. This is one of the daughters. But it is projected on her. She becomes the archetypal lover in his mind, the source. And often you get these daughters in these situations who are their father's little hetara, his little lover. And of course this wounds them for life unless they get outstanding help, which is not very often. But you're absolutely right about that. See, you just look at family systems theory. Just remember, this stuff is all occurring in family systems. And all of these archetypal patterns are either accepted and encouraged or repressed and split off within a family system. Each family handles it differently. You might even say each culture handles it differently. But you think about it particularly in terms of the family system. Ask in your family what they did with the archetypal lover. It's been a European pattern, carried over to some degree, that the archetypal lover is always split off outside the family. The family is the mother and father. And the husband calls the wife mother, and the mother calls the husband daddy, and they have affairs. But that's all an archetypal dance. Now, one of the things we can talk about after our break is the way in which these four things regulate each other, or are supposed to. If there's no lover, the other things go awry. If there's not an adequate, healthy expression of the archetypal lover, there's no eros in these other forms, and that's very dangerous. You get necrophilia then. Okay, let's take about a 10-minute break. About the relationship of these things and when they go awry. Let me just go over that briefly and lift up how I see that reflected. Clearly, in this little story of Camelot, the king Arthur doesn't feel very much like a king. He's not really very much in touch with the archetype. He's very intimidated by the role. And he's constantly looking for everybody else to tell him how to do it. Lancelot is pictured as somebody coming in as all warrior, pure, not a profligate bone in his body, according to his presentation of it. But in them both is this being split off from the lover. When Arthur finally does get into being king, he forgets to mind the lover part of his responsibilities. And that creates a situation in which Lancelot's shadow is given a real encouragement to constellate, come out, possess him, doing exactly what he always claimed he would not do, which is to destroy the world, in effect. Now that, the absence of the insights of Merlin from both personalities should strike you in the context of our discussion. If Arthur had had enough Merlin, he would have had enough insight into men and women to know that he couldn't get away with neglecting his role as a lover. If Lancelot had had enough Merlin, he would have understood that he wasn't that out of touch with the possibility to be an adulterer. So in that story, you have a very subtle, insightful rehearsal of these dynamics. If you just look, get past the sort of trite comedy of it, and look at the archetypal relationships. The king gives a person a sense for realm and power and responsibility, being the orderer. Without the lover present, though, there won't be a capacity to really take delight in the realm. And if you can't take delight in your children or your subjects, so to speak, if you can't see how beautiful they are in and of themselves, then you won't want to build a world for them. You will not want to create a cosmos for them. This is what happens with your shadow king. Your shadow king hasn't got enough love. He doesn't really care that much about the subjects and the realm. He really cares very little even about himself, but he cares more about himself than he does about anybody else. And so you can see how when that archetypal lover aspect is not present in the king, he will be a shadow king. Look at the magus. Magus gives you great power of seeing. You look in and you understand and you know. But if that archetypal lover is not constellated in a mature, healthy way, you will be in that thing like you are in the king in the similar thing. You will not truly love those for whom you are trying to create transformation. What does that mean? Well, what it means is you're not really seriously interested in their transformation. What it means is you're interested in their adulation and their money. And the fact of the matter is, if you study a lot of the literature on countertransference and transference, more and more, like I just got this new book on Kohut's legacy, there's this wonderful article in there by this person that's saying a lot of the diagnosis of patients of analysans as really being borderline is because of the lack of the empathic capacities of the therapist. A lot of the tendency to re-diagnose difficult patients, quote, difficult patients, unquote, is really grounded in the lack of empathic, that's what the Kohutians want to say. They don't want to say love. That would embarrass them. That would not be professional. What they're talking about is love. What they're talking about is the capacity for the therapist to love the analysan appropriately. Now, they will never admit to that, but that's what it's talking about. If the lover is not constellated in the magus will be a shadow magus. Because without the eros, the capacity to appreciate the beauty and the wonder, the miraculousness of this being out here that is not me, without that, there is no reverence. And without reverence, and I don't even mean respect, I mean reverence. Without reverence, there's no healing. There's no healing. Yes?
Define a little bit what the borderline personality is. I have a vague sense of it, but I don't have a specific sense.
Well, it's hard to define. A lot better people than I am have not done a good job defining it. But what it means is somebody who's been so wounded developmentally that they are enormously unstable. They're not psychotic most of the time, but they are very sensitive to trauma and stress and will go into sort of mini psychoses under trauma or stress and usually act out a lot, are very self-destructive in attempts just to stay minimally cohesive. And, most of the people that are substance abusers in a pretty big way are in this category. Most alcoholics are borderlines. But it's just widespread. And they are very close to the archetypal, another way to say it. That is, their ego structures are so fragile that they're like, they're sort of like a landing strip for UFOs, It's like blink, 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 you know. Are you up there? You know, and they just, you know, you land, you know, you get a lot of borderlines that are shamans. You know, if you have these self-announced shamans, a lot of them borderlines. You know, but that's when the magus lands. If the magus lands, you know, they're probably a shaman. If the king lands, they think they are, you know, they're going to run for president, like some of these right-wing dudes that I can't think of his name right now. Yeah. Well, LaRouche. If the lover lands, then you've got all this promiscuous acting out, you know. Well, so and so on and so forth. Well, yeah. But I think it'd be more like Lieutenant Calley. I mean, that would be more clear. Lieutenant Calley, the My Lai lieutenant. So that when this warrior or when this archetype, see, that's when you don't have a strong ego, you're just a landing strip for the archetypal.
By that you mean possession?
Yes, I mean archetypal possession. And it's much more common than people think about. See, to understand, see, you look at most, if you're Jungian and you're not, I mean, if you're a classical Jungian and you understand this business, then most of severe psychopathology is clearly possession phenomena. And a lot of not very severe psychopathology is possession phenomena. But you have to get a sense for the way this would look. Your narcissistic personality disorder is clearly a possession phenomenon, see, of the king. A lot of the time, the sociopath is a warrior possession. And you can see that in the way in which the warrior is so constellated in your criminal culture. But anyway, but when that lover is not balanced by the centeredness of the king and by the loyalty of the warrior. See, if you don't have that loyalty quality that the warrior has, you won't ever be loyal you won't be loyal to the transpersonal things, and you'll just go running after the first Aphrodite or the first Eros that comes along. And your responsibilities, without the warrior archetype, your responsibilities, they're just not that important. See? And without the magus, all of these things get out of whack. Because you're not aware of what's going on. And this is why, like if you look back, think of David, the king, and Nathan the prophet. You know that story? Well, here's David, who is this. If you don't know about David, first thing you should do, if you haven't read the story, is you should get the movie with Richard Gere, of all people, playing David, the king. And you know, the casting isn't as bad as you might think, because Gere does a good job of playing this crazy archetypal lover. I mean, if you haven't seen him in all these, he plays the crazy archetypal lover in all these. He's the crazy, you know, sort of stoned lover in all these. I'm thinking of that thing where they have Jerry Lee Lewis music playing. What I can't. Well, there anyway. If you just look at Richard Gere's movies, it's always this crazy archetypal lover. Well, when they cast him in the role of David, they intuited. I don't think they had thought this through, but they intuited the sense in which David was having a problem with the archetypal lover. David the king, here he is the king, great warrior, fantastic warrior, par excellence, magnificent general. And yet a great lover who loved Saul the king so much he had a chance to kill him and wouldn't. His son, Absalom, tries to overthrow him and to have him killed, but he loves his son Absalom so much he doesn't want the son killed. See? And then he sees Bathsheba, right, the wife of Uriah, and he loves her when he looks down upon her naked body. And truly he does love her. He sees her beauty. And he is overwhelmed with this. He sends the general, he sends Uriah off to the front where he knows he'll be killed. And then, but you see, he's completely unaware of the immorality at this point of what he's doing. The biblical tradition presents him as not being in touch with this. Then Nathan the prophet, the Magus, comes in, confronts him. In one of those stories where the Magus doesn't get killed. You know, it's very dangerous being a Magus, because you tell the truth when you're a Magus. A true Magus tells the truth, see, to these others, and it's never good news. That's one thing about the Magus. When your Magus is constellated, it never tells you what you want to hear. It always tells you, no, think again. What are you doing? But anyway, so Nathan tells David what he's done. He uses a teaching story. It's like in Zen or somebody uses a teaching story to get David to indict himself. And then it's presented, and the whole thing goes on from there. But it is a magnificent story of a magnificent man. And I always like to say to people, David is as good as we get. This is as good as we get, this image of him. In the biblical story, the humans don't get much better than David. And you took in him, boy, you talk about shadow and warts and misbehaviors. They're clear. But all the Psalms, are allegedly his prayers. And they are good for those that have no objection to them. They're good things to read to help you with your ego self-access, because they're real honest. But anyway, you see that in that. You see the tendency to be disordered in one or the other of these. And the task is for them to be mutually regulating. And when any of them are not adequately present, in David's case it is the Magus. He was split off from the insight into what was going on. He was able conveniently not to notice what he was doing and what it really meant. Well, it turns out that he pays very dearly. He ends up, he marries this woman, but their firstborn dies, and that is presented in the story as his punishment. Like in so many of those things, you wonder who's paying the price here. But
you mean Nathan foretold that?
Yeah. But the point is the teaching story is that when you encounter the Magus and you've been inflated, there will have to be a sacrifice. There will have to be some humiliation. And see, in the initiatory process, we always talk about humiliation always being a part of initiation. Well, humiliation is always a part of individuation. But what is it that's humiliated? Only the grandiosity. It's like if you're not puffed up, it's hard to be knocked down. You don't get deflated unless you are inflated. So anyway, let's open it up now. We've got about a quarter of an hour, and if you have questions to raise, just jump in, go as fast as we can. See the way that they're articulating together.
So a mentor would be a combination of
yes, all of them.
A Magus, a king, a lover.
You have to be, because if you had no lover, you would really not have value in yourself. See, it's only when you're possessed by the archetypal lover that you see the value in everyone and therefore value no one. See, no loyalty. But see, I really believe that you can access those archetypal, that you should access those archetypal lover energies. And that we have, feel that we have a moral imperative to develop that archetypal lover in us so that we can have that kind of consciousness that you see in the artist. It's not, these people that talk about the arts and the artist as mediating something transformative and essential to the human race. See, this is what they're getting at. The artist is the person who is trying to help people to get past the repression of this lover aspect so that you can see. William Blake talks about this stuff, cleansing the perception, the doors of perception. So hopefully you get to where you can love very, very promiscuously without acting out all over the place. See what I mean? Because you ought to be able, see, in my view, see, here's the thing that I think that it's very important to learn from the gay community. See, I think that one of the things the gay community, both male and female, may be there for the human race, is to help people learn to love same sex in a much more healthy way. Because most of the time, most of us are so damaged in our same-sex relationships that it's very difficult for us really to take delight in someone of our own sex, especially in their physical beauty, their beauty. And one of the things that I think that is being compensated by the gay community in the general culture is the very narrow way in which we allow ourselves to see beauty and celebrate it. See? Very few men can look even in the mirror and say, you're beautiful. Very, very few. And they should be able to do that. Read Leaves of Grass. Walt Whitman. If you want to know what I'm talking about, read Walt Whitman. Or any other decent writer. D.H. Warren. Yeah.
What about the struggle to keep these things in balance in a society with specialization?
Oh, it is. Well, you see, this is what people underestimate. Because staying away from the archetypal makes a lot of sense if you understand the difficulty of what you're talking about. Because the seductive power of these things, it's just like an undertow at the beach. If you've been wiped out lately with an undertow in the surf, you know what I'm talking about. The kind that you're walking out just a little ways and it picks you up, and yanks your feet out from under you, and just slams you down into the bottom. Pow! That's the way this works. Hence the importance, and there are Jungians, I won't call any names, but James Hillman are the initials. There are some Jungians that at least sound like they're disparaging ego psychology. Sort of saying it's not important, the ego, really too much stuff said about the ego. Well, the ego is enormously important in terms of developing its capacity to resist the seductions and the possession of these archetypal patterns. You see, these archetypal patterns are real. And they're not, to talk about them as patterns is even misleading. They are entities with their own shape and their own agendas and their own magnetic fields. And when you get into one, then it has its own agenda for you. You really get into the professional workaholic persona, your ego isn't doing all that. Once you start getting into that workaholic thing, that archetypal warrior is coming out, getting you more committed in every way, and wanting more and more and more of you. That's why there's never enough time. That's why the stuff that one takes home in the briefcase gets getting fatter and fatter and fatter. You know. So the important thing is to realize how seductive these things are. They have their agency. They're a source of initiative. And that one has to stand up against that. And standing up against it is not easy. And so it requires discipline. That's the bad news. The development of the ego self-axis requires discipline, because what you want to do is to access that energy, use it as instinctual fuel, but not be had by it. And that is, you're right. You're seeing the problem. It's enormously difficult. And with the fewer containers we've got now, there are fewer and fewer cultural supports to help us keep from, acting it all out.
It's the magus that keeps
the inner,
in
right.
line.
The magus talks to you, It's always like Merlin or Nathan is saying, now, what's up? What are you up to now? Aren't your circuits heating up a little bit now? Don't you really think you need to go to the gym today instead of doing one more project? When was the last time you took her out? Or when was the last time you took the time really to smell of him and let him know it? See, the magus will ask all these questions, provided there's enough lover there for the magus to give a damn. Yeah.
I get a chance to hear a number of people's stories, and one of the things that I hear frequently is, particularly in young adults, is there's been a relationship where oftentimes the term is used as soulmate.
Yes.
I have found soulmate.
Yes.
Sometimes those relationships work, sometimes they don't. And my question has to do with what's going on there, and what's the distinction between loving everybody and having a soulmate or several soulmates? Is there a distinction there? It seems like it's two kinds of loves.
Yeah, well, it's related. Christians have been too quick to divide these things up. They are related. There are distinctions. The important thing I would say there is the soulmate has got to be a human. And that's where Jungian stuff comes in, talks about this anima projection or animus projection. See, the anima or animus is really archetypal projection. In other words, when you're projecting your anima or your animus onto another, a lover, that is an archetypal projection that's going to be disappointed. And it is not appropriate for it to be left on that outer person. Because when it is, it will guarantee the destruction of the relationship, or it will guarantee a very, very dependent kind of sort of regressive relatedness. When you're projecting that inner contrasexual archetypal figure on the other, you will be dependent in a destructive way, as long as that is consuming the relationship. That is the archetypal lover projection. Now, if by soulmate they mean a partner, a human partner, who you take delight in and who you share many things with, and who can play the role, say, for the man, of the hetara, the companion, that woman has a lot of Aphrodite in her, but she is not Aphrodite. See? It's one thing to be with a partner that has a lot of the archetypal lover mediated through them. It's quite another thing to think they are the archetypal lover. And I think that's the distinction. When I hear soulmate, like I think of one guy, 30 years old, he's had this projection on this woman and he's loved from afar for years. And she is his soulmate. Well, she is his anima. And she's been trying to get him to leave her alone for years. And he can't, because if he did, he would have to deal with how wounded he is in his loves. And he's not prepared to do that. And he is a borderline. So the important thing, see, is whether, the archetypal lover thing will make it possible for you to experience another person as a partner, a delightful soulmate. But the important thing is how much loader is being jacked up on them. And a lot of time it's Redeemer, Savior, save me. Everybody else has been blah, blah, blah. You're gonna save me. You're not gonna have any flaws. You're going to be able essentially to mirror me in Kohut's terms. To mirror me. Well, a lover will mirror you for a little while. Yeah.
You know, when it says, instead of two lovers looking into each other's eyes, two lovers sitting next to each other looking out at the world, and all that love we're talking about, they love the world together.
Yeah. Yeah, that is, it is not just compulsive, but I think I do think that it's not infatuation to be so delighted by somebody that you're in a relationship with that they just delight you so much that you can hardly stand it. I don't think that's crazy at all. I've known a lot of people like that. And I've known a lot of people for whom, after they get married, there's more delight in each other as the time goes on. It's just that most of our experiences are not like that. But I mean, it doesn't, Robert Johnson confuses people sometimes on this. The way he presents it. Robert Johnson, you can have him edit this stuff out if you want. But a lot of the stuff he says in we, tones down the relationship between lovers to the extent that it loses a lot of life, in my view. And I don't think that's necessary. I think you can have a lot of energy between lovers and not be a possession. In fact, I think people like Marcuse and Norman Brown and some of these poets understand that. And people shouldn't settle for boredom in relationships. That's crazy. Yeah.
My understanding of Hillman's incorrect. I had the sense that he was trying to do the same thing in a way with reacting to his over-cerebral, kind of analytical approaches to things and letting these archetypes really live. I mean, he may have gone off kind of half-cocked and kind of got off one way a little too far, but isn't that a kind of balancing thing?
I'm sure he had the best of motivations, but we have to take responsibility for what we say. You know, the fact is, he says a lot of things, in my view, that I would not want any therapist operating on. See, he's a brilliant man. I love reading his stuff, but I'd like to watch him treat a borderline.
Yeah, his own work, does he balance that with...
See, I don't know. I never had a chance to watch him through a two-way window and see him treat a borderline and see if he's as much of a deconstructionist dealing with a borderline as he talks. Because, frankly, a borderline doesn't need any deconstructionist. They are a deconstructionist. They need a constructionist. And so I don't think it's just a matter of emphasis. I think Hillman is really missing a lot of the essentials of Jungian psychology.
In a sense, he's reacting against his own kind of scholastic past. You know?
Well, he was director of studies at the Jung Institute in Zurich for a while. I'm sure he's reacting to that and the literalism. You know, there's a lot of literalism among some Jungians, and that's a problem. But, you know, it's a long way from being a literalistic Jungian to deconstructing the ego and archetypes till they don't really mean anything. What I'm saying, the archetypal psychology I'm propounding believes both in the reality of the archetypal structures that are deep structures that are in the psyche that can be seen by anybody who's been trained, and the reality of the ego, without which people are either crazy or in danger of being crazy. And you get, it's one thing, a lot of Freudians, good solid Freudians, need to read Hillman. But I fear for what happens with a lot of people that don't know anything about ego psychology, self-psychology, or object relations theory that read Hillman and then start practicing on people. That's all I got to say. Yeah.
This relates to what you were talking about, the container.
Yeah.
That I don't quite understand that fully. You were saying that something about society doesn't provide.
In the old days, your tribe's values were clear, and you transgressed them to your own risk. They would banish you or kill you if you got too far afield. It wasn't any problem about knowing what the values were. You've heard all this stuff about the crack in the cosmic egg. Well, until modernity, there weren't any cracks in the cosmic eggs. People didn't have a crisis of meaning. The only crisis of meaning you had was when your cosmic egg didn't agree with the one that had the political power. Like if you were one of the heretics in the medieval period, you didn't have them. You knew what was right. You had your values clear. They just differed with the Pope, and the Pope had the troops. And but in modernity, things have just, the containers in which that carry the human soul have just been dissolving all over the place. And the best thing to do, if you haven't studied this in history or cultural history, is to read Peter Berger, the great sociologist, and read his book, The Homeless Mind. And it lays this out. But the fact is, religions, for educated people, tend not to hold it anymore. Now, the reason around the world that fundamentalisms are resurgent in every tradition is because of the need for containment. And we should not laugh at people so much about this. They understand something. The Ayatollah, one of the reasons that the Ayatollah is doing what he is doing is not as bad a reason as we might think without thinking about it. He has looked at what is happening to the young people in his culture who have gotten into Western culture, into drugs, sex, and rock and roll in a totally out of control way. And he's decided, hey, this stuff is destructive for my people. And he and the other Shiites, that's what they're about. They are against nihilism and antinomianism. And if you start looking at what's happening to the young people of this country, you have to ask the question, okay, you don't want the Ayatollah, and you don't want Jerry Falwell, and you don't want blah, 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 blah. Where are the containers to help these young people not destroy themselves before they're 21? Yes, yes. The whole issue is, you see, where are the cultural vessels? Well, I'll tell you some names of some cultural vessels in our society for young people. Madonna. That's a cultural vessel for a lot of young people. You got to be clear about it. Prince is a cultural vessel for a lot of people. Well, that's a Magus. Prince is a Magus. If you haven't been to any of Prince's movies, he's a Magus. Yeah. Somebody else had their hand up. We're out of time. I'll stick around a few minutes and talk with you individually. I've really enjoyed this. You've been great. It's been a pleasure to be with you.